Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Asshifa Magfirani Humanis and I am a student of the course Conflict Resolution in Islamic Perspectives. And for my final project, I will be presenting on the topic of the role of the UN in resolving the Iran and Iraq War of 1980 to 1988. This presentation will cover several things. The first one would be the background of the conflict, including the causes of the war. The next one would be the dynamics of the conflict, including how the war started and how it escalated, how it de-escalated. And then the third one would be the relevancy of the Prophet Muhammad's methods of conflict resolution used in his period were relevant to the ones used by the UN in resolving the Iraq-Iran War of 1980 to 1988. Firstly, we would need to define several of the keywords that would be used throughout the presentation. The first one is conflict. According to Weeks, conflict means a prolonged battle or collision, the opposition of mutually exclusive impulses, desires, or tendencies, a controversy, or a disagreement. Meanwhile, as stated by Fisher, it indicates the state of being hostile, a discord of action and feeling. It could also be defined as an incompatibility of goals or values between two or more parties in a relationship, combined with the attempts to control each other and antagonistic feelings towards each other. Meanwhile, as defined by Rashid, conflict resolution means a range of methods of eradicating sources of conflict or any reduction in the severity of a conflict or the process of resolving disputes between parties. It generally works in three phases. The first one is prevention, the second is reduction of the intensity of the conflict, and finally is the ultimate resolution of the conflict. The next will be the background of the conflict between Iran and Iraq. The Iran-Iraq War was a protracted armed conflict that began on the 22nd of September 1980 when Iraq invaded neighboring Iran. The war lasted almost 8 years, ending in a stalemate on the 20th of August 1988 when Iran accepted a UN-brokered ceasefire. For the origins of the conflict, the war was an unavoidable product of the volatile situation present in the Middle East during that time. The roots of the war itself lay in a number of territorial and political disputes between Iraq and Iran, and the relationship between the two states was particularly unstable as Saddam Hussein desperately wanted to take control of the Shatt al-Arab, which is a waterway that empties into the Persian Gulf and forms the boundary between Iran and Iraq. Iraq also hoped to seize the western Iranian region of Khuzestan, an area known for its extensive oil fields. In 1975, a military weaker Iraq had by treaty signed over to Iran partial control of the waterway. This agreement was supposed to have solved the dispute between the two countries, but Saddam chafed under its constraints. Besides, he only signed it to end a Kurdish rebellion supported via Iranian arms shipments. His militant attitude only intensified after the 1979 Iranian Revolution, which saw the rise of an Islamic theocratic government that was ideologically opposed to Saddam's secular Ba'athist dictatorship. Saddam was concerned over the attempts by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary government to incite rebellion among Iraq's Shi'i majority. Tensions finally boiled over into open hostility on September 22, 1980, when the Iraqi Air Force commenced a preemptive strike on Iranian Air Force the following day. Next comes the dynamics of the conflict. The beginning is in 1979, when border clashes began to occur frequently, and Saddam announced in September 1980 that he was abrogating the 1975 agreements because they had been violated by Iran. Within days, Iraqi forces invaded Iran. At the same time, Iraq bombed Iranian air bases and other strategic targets. In the week following the invasion, the UN Security Council called for a ceasefire and appealed to Iran and Iraq to settle their disputes in a peaceful manner. The Iraqi president replied, saying that Iraq would accept a ceasefire provided Iran did as well. Iran's response, however, was negative. The war thus continued and in succeeding years was extended to the Gulf area. It has been aptly called the Gulf War. Although Iraq hoped to take advantage of Iran's post-revolutionary chaos and expected a decisive victory in the face of a severely weakened Iran, the Iraqi military only made progress for 3 months, and by December 1980, the invasion had stalled. There it followed a stalemate that continued until September 1981, when Iran, which had rejected further attempts at mediation, began a series of successful offensives. By May 1982, the Iraqis had been driven from most of the captured territory. As fierce fighting broke out between the two sides, the Iranian military started to gain momentum against the Iraqis and regained virtually all lost territory by June 1982 and pushed the Iraqis back to the pre-war borderlines. Iranian forces began to penetrate into Iraq's al-Basra province, and following this, the next 5 years saw Iran go on the offensive. However, in 1987, the military balance tended to favor Iraq, which has raised an army of some 1 million, and while Iran remained largely isolated from the international community, had obtained state-of-the-art arms from France and the Soviet Union, including thousands of artillery pieces, tanks, and armored personnel carriers, and hundreds of combat aircraft. The proxy forces operating in this war, the United States, United Kingdom, Soviet Union, France, and most Arab countries, provided an abundance of financial, political, and logistical support for Iraq, while Iran was largely isolated. Military operations in the Gulf resumed, and in April 1988, Iraq used chemical weapons against the Iranian troops. It became clear that Iran's military position in the Gulf had become very weak, and it eventually accepted Resolution 598, which came into force on August 20, 1988. Next, we will talk about the impacts of the conflict. The number of casualties was enormous but equally uncertain. The number killed on both sides was approximately 500,000, with Iran suffering the greatest losses. $228 billion were directly expended, and more than $400 billion of damage was inflicted. The war had been one of the most destructive conflicts of the late 20th century. Hundreds of thousands had died, and large areas of western Iran and southeastern Iraq had been devastated. So the question now is, what is the role of the UN, and how has it contributed to the resolving of the Iraq-Iran war? Attempts by the UN to seek an end to the war dated back to 1980, when an outbreak of armed conflict between Iran and Iraq prompted Secretary General Kurt Waldheim to offer his good offices to work for a peaceful settlement for the conflict. On September 1980, in accordance with the Article 99 of the UN Charter, he brought to the attention of the Security Council the threat to the maintenance of international peace and security. In Resolution 479 of 28 September 1980, the Council, among other things, called upon Iran and Iraq to refrain immediately from any further use of force and to settle their dispute by peaceful means. However, it had very little effect. These efforts stalled for many years over the issues of responsibility of the war and also the control of the Shatt al-Arab border. Eventually, after the two states mutually unwilling to compromise and kept the continuity of the 8 years long of war exhaustion, economic devastation, decreased morale, military stalemate, lack of international sympathy against the use of weapons of mass destruction, and also the increased US-Iran military tensions, the conflict was finally ended with a final ceasefire brokered by the United Nations. Resolution number 598, enacted by the UNSC, called for an immediate ceasefire between Iran and Iraq and the repatriation of prisoners of war, and for both sides to withdraw to the international border. The resolution requested the Secretary General to dispatch a team of observers to monitor the ceasefire while a permanent settlement was reached to end the conflict. The resolution eventually became effective on August 1988, ending all combat operations between the two countries and the Iran-Iraq war. After that, the UN peacekeepers belonging to the United Nations formed the Iraq-Iran Military Observer Group mission, which took the field, remaining on the Iran-Iraq border until 1991. Next, we will be discussing about how the conflict resolution methods of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, during his period were relevant to those used by the UN in resolving the Iran and Iraq war. The methods used by the Prophet Muhammad during his period are comparable and still highly relevant to those that we use in nowadays. For instance, after Hijrah, the Prophet had to perform some noteworthy acts to establish a safe and secure state in Medina, among which is the Medina Charter, which was one of his greatest works. The Jews, a considerable power of the city, were divided into three major clans: Banu Kainuka, Banu Nadir, and Banu Qurayza. Banu Nadir and Banu Qurayza were the allies of the Aus and Khazraj, respectively, and hence they took active part in the warfare of Medina. Prophet Muhammad tried to create a commonwealth uniting these groups and called everyone together for mutual adjustment and cooperation. In this context, the Prophet consulted with the representatives of each parties and litigated a charter for the city-states of Medina, a formal constitution and a covenant for its citizens. Historians consider this agreement as the first written charter the world history has ever seen. So here, the Prophet Muhammad diplomatically brought the two parties on a familiar point of revelation of God, so that they became bound to keep peace and order of Medina according to their own revelations. Seeing this, we could examine that the methods used, particularly the historic enactment of the Medina Charter, is still highly relevant in this day and age. The utilization of a covenant, a treaty, or generally a written document agreed upon by the stakeholders within the conflict could play a very pivotal role in the development of cooperation and also mutual adjustment. In the case of the Iran-Iraq War, a peace agreement, namely the Resolution number 598, was signed, finalizing the terms for the elimination of the ongoing armed conflict between Iran and Iraq. Secondly, another significant attempt by the Prophet to resolve conflict and tension the historians recorded is called the Hilful Fudul, or the Alliance of Fudul. It was an oath to resolve chaos, disorder, and conflict from the society of Mecca. Basically, it was the consequence of the Battle of Fijar, the sacrilegious war. In the absence of central authority in Mecca, this battle was broken out in the fair of Ukaz between the Quraysh and the Qais tribes. It prolongs its bloody feuds by 10 years, from 580 to 590 AD, in the valley of Mecca by the revengeful temper of the Arab tribes. As a result of the war, the law and order of Arabia have been broken. Society became unsecure to live in a number of lives were lost. Oppression, hijack, and robbery took place of the hospitality in the entire territory. In this situation, some kind-hearted people took initiative and formed the Hilful Fudul, a committee for peace. And this oath played an important role to establish peace in Arabia, and history remarks that there were no more wars or iniquities that took place for many years after this formation. This is relevant to the way the United Nations formed the Iraq-Iran Military Observer Group, which is a commission created by the UNSC in Resolution 619 of August 9, 1988. According to the UN, the committee was established in August 1988 to verify, confirm, and supervise the ceasefire and the withdrawal of all forces to the internationally recognized boundaries, pending a comprehensive settlement. This committee was eventually terminated in February 1999 after Iran and Iraq had fully withdrawn their forces to the internationally recognized boundaries. The withdrawal of the committee forces in 1999 marked the official end to the Iran-Iraq war. We could see here that the relevancy of the formation of particular committees to oversee the progress of conflict resolution efforts in a particular region is very crucial in the maintaining and the upholding of peace. In conclusion, the Iran-Iraq war has become a testament to one of the most successful stories of the UN in mediating a major regional conflict. To establish peace and order in human society, Islam also emphasizes on resolving conflicts. In this regard, the Prophet Muhammad dictated some unique processes by his sayings and practices. Critical evaluation of those methods proves his mastermind in greatness of all ages, as proven by the relevancy of those methods even hundreds of years after the prophetic period. The current methods that we perform today to resolve conflicts could be seen to be the modified version of his practices, which can be proved by the examples of the above discussions. These notions are all crucial for its contribution towards resolution efforts to the world's current affairs and ultimately the promotion of peace. Thank you so much for watching my video today. I hope everyone gains a little insight on the topic, and wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.